The jungle is still black before dawn. A low mist clings to the fields near Cabanatuan, where the air smells of wet rice stalks and burnt engine oil. American Rangers crouch in silence, the metal clips on their rifles dulled with tape. Ahead of them lies a prison camp, rows of bamboo huts, barbed wire glinting faintly under a fading moon. Inside, hundreds of gaunt American prisoners are waking to another morning of weakness and hunger. They no longer count the days. A thin line of smoke rises from the guardhouse kitchen, carrying the bitter scent of rice and fish heads. Beyond the walls, unseen in the darkness, the rescuers wait. Minutes later, the night erupts rifle fire, shouted orders, boots in the mud. In less than half an hour, the camp's silence is broken forever. As the first prisoners stumble out, blinded by torchlight, something else fills the air, the warm, unmistakable smell of coffee and cooked meat. For the first time in years. It isn't a dream. That moment, the first meal of freedom, would astonish their captors more than any weapon ever could. This is the story of how Japanese soldiers mocked U.S. rations, until they saw POWs eating like kings. By 1944, the American war machine had become an empire of logistics. While soldiers fought in jungles, deserts, and frozen mountains, a vast invisible army labored behind them, engineers, chemists, farmers, and factory workers, all devoted to one simple promise: no American soldier would go hungry. That promise was born years earlier, in quiet laboratories and test kitchens. In 1941, physiologist Ansel Keys at the University of Minnesota designed a compact, calorie-dense meal that could fit in a pocket and sustain a man for a day. It was called the K-ration, 3 small boxes labeled breakfast, dinner, and supper. Each contained tins of meat, biscuits, powdered beverage, candy, and cigarettes. Light enough for a paratrooper to carry into combat, strong enough to fuel long marches. It was revolutionary. Unlike the heavy tin C rations of early campaigns, the K-ration symbolized movement, speed, and efficiency, the logistical heartbeat of the American way of war. By late 1943, millions of them rolled off assembly lines across the United States. Inside each cardboard carton was the industrial might of a continent: Midwest corn syrup, Pennsylvania beef, California fruit, and chocolate from Hershey. Pennsylvania, for frontline troops, the contents were both comfort and identity. Opening a K-ration meant the system still worked somewhere. Trains were running, ships were unloading, and someone back home had remembered you. In the Pacific, that reliability contrasted sharply with the Japanese experience. Their soldiers, trained for hardship, often lived on rice balls, dried fish, or miso paste carried in cloth pouches. The Imperial Japanese Army's doctrine prized endurance, not comfort. Supplies were minimal, often improvised or foraged. When logistics broke down, as they did in New Guinea, Guadalcanal, and Burma, starvation became a weapon of its own. Entire regiments wasted away not from bullets but from lack of food. American rations, in contrast, reflected abundance. A single K-ration meal packed about 900 calories. The full day's issue totaled more than 2,800, enough to keep a soldier moving through tropical heat or mountain cold. The taste wasn't gourmet, but it was steady, predictable, engineered. Even its packaging, wax-sealed cardboard, spoke of industrial precision. By 1944, American rations came in endless forms: C rations for long campaigns, B units for cooks in the field, and 10-inch-1 packs for platoons on the move. Liberty ships and cargo planes carried tons of them across oceans. Every invasion beachhead was followed by kitchens, refrigeration units, and mobile bakeries. Fresh bread, canned peaches, powdered eggs, these were more than food. They were symbols of home. To a hungry enemy soldier or prisoner, the sight of those boxes was unimaginable. They represented an empire of supply, a system that seemed impossible to exhaust. Captured Japanese diaries often remarked on this difference. Some described finding unopened cans of meat or coffee in abandoned American camps and writing in disbelief at how well they eat. Others mocked it at first, calling Americans soft, dependent on luxuries that would vanish in real war. But as months passed and the U.S. advance accelerated, that arrogance began to fade. The men who once sneered at tinned food came to fear what it meant: endless, unstoppable replacement. Each K-ration box was more than nourishment. It was proof that American logistics could bridge any ocean, feed any army, and outlast any blockade. From Normandy to the Solomons, the same stamped tins appeared: U.S. Army Field Ration Type K, a small seal of victory printed in cardboard. As 1945 approached, the full power of that system was about to meet its most human test. Not on the front lines, but in the prison camps where thousands of starving Allied soldiers waited behind barbed wire. There, the meaning of American abundance would become something deeper than strategy or efficiency, because soon, those rations, chocolate bars, meat tins, and powdered milk would be placed into trembling hands that hadn't touched real food in years. And for the Japanese guards who witnessed it, the moment would append everything they believed about strength, honor, and endurance. The story of the K-ration was about to collide with the story of captivity and liberation. When American rations reached the Pacific, they entered a war unlike any fought before. Vast distances, brutal climates, and a fierce enemy shaped every movement. By early 1942, the tide had turned against the Allies. The fall of the Philippines, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies marked the beginning of one of the darkest chapters of the war: the captivity of tens of thousands of Allied troops. In the Philippines alone, more than 75,000 American and Filipino soldiers surrendered after months of hopeless defense on the Bataan Peninsula. The Japanese army, unprepared to handle prisoners in such numbers, treated surrender as shame. Captivity, in their code, erased honor. For those who had fought under a flag that promised no man left behind, the contrast could not have been sharper. The result was the Bataan Death March, a 60-mile ordeal under the tropical sun. Men who had survived disease and starvation were forced to march without food, without water. Guards beat those who stumbled. By the time the columns reached the railheads at San Fernando, thousands were dead. Those who survived entered a network of camps scattered across the Philippines, Formosa, and the Japanese home islands. In these camps, food was the weapon most often used. Rations for prisoners were measured not in calories but in humiliation: a handful of rice, sometimes mixed with husks, mold, or worm-infested barley. Protein was scarce. Vegetables were nearly absent. The average POW received less than 800 calories a day. Over time, men became skeletons, their uniforms hanging like flags over bones. Diseases, beriberi, pellagra, dysentery, thrived. The Japanese guards, many of them young conscripts, followed a system that equated suffering with discipline. They believed prisoners deserved hardship. Yet, as the war dragged on, even some of these guards began to grasp the enormity of their captives' endurance. Occasionally, a sympathetic civilian or lower-ranking guard smuggled scraps of food, but discovery meant severe punishment or death. Meanwhile, far beyond the barbed wire, the United States had begun the long road back. The Pacific Islands fell one by one: Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Peleliu, Leyte. Each victory pushed the front closer to the Philippines, and with it came the hope that the forgotten men in the camps might yet be freed. But by 1944, the Japanese military faced a dilemma. Their empire was shrinking, supplies collapsing, and transport routes cut by American submarines. Prisoners became a burden and sometimes a liability. Orders circulated to execute captives should the Allies approach. The most notorious example came later that year, when over 100 American prisoners were massacred at Palawan. Still, even amid the cruelty, the human details remained. Prisoners kept small diaries, scratched with stolen pencils or carved into wooden boards. They wrote about hunger, about dreams of food, about imaginary meals that helped them sleep. Many described memories of coffee, buttered toast, cold milk, things that had become sacred fantasies. In one such diary, found after liberation, a prisoner wrote, "We imagined the smell of bacon as if it could keep us alive. Sometimes it does. For nearly 3 years, thousands of Allied soldiers existed on the edge of starvation. They were kept alive by sheer will, friendship, and faith that their country would return. They did not know that, across the Pacific, American supply officers were already calculating how to feed them when that day came. Down to the ounce of sugar and powdered milk, that day would arrive in early 1945. American and Filipino units launched operations to free the remaining camps. The most famous, the raid at Cabanatuan, involved the 6th Ranger Battalion, Filipino guerrillas, and Alamo Scouts. It was a mission of precision and mercy to reach 500 starving prisoners before the Japanese could kill them. When the gates of Cabanatuan fell, the world of the camps ended. What began as a logistical challenge, how to feed an army, had turned into a humanitarian triumph, but the liberation was not only a rescue of bodies. It was a revelation of contrasts. The Japanese soldiers, who once mocked the indulgence of American food, would soon witness a sight they could not comprehend. Men who had nearly died being revived by the rations they had scorned. The encounter between starvation and abundance would become one of the quiet turning points of the Pacific War's end. When the Rangers reached the camp at Cabanatuan, they found silence, a terrible, breathing silence that told its own story. Hundreds of men lay in huts no larger than tool sheds. Their bodies, starved and sunburned, were draped in rags. The smell was unmistakable: sweat, sickness, rot, and a faint sweetness from decaying rice stalk. To understand what came next, one must grasp the physiological toll of captivity. Starvation changes the body in ways that are both visible and hidden. In the Cabanatuan and Las Barras camps, the average prisoner weighed less than 100 pounds. Their hearts had shrunk, their livers hardened, and their blood sugar levels were critically low. The human metabolism, deprived for months, becomes fragile. Too much food too quickly can kill. American medics knew this. They had studied the reports from European internment camps and prepared for what they called refeeding syndrome. Their orders were precise: begin with small portions, soft foods, high in carbohydrates and electrolytes. The rescuers carried tins of evaporated milk, instant oatmeal, fruit juice powder, and meat hash from K&C rations. What looked like a simple meal was, in fact, an emergency medical operation. The first bites came with disbelief. Some liberated men tried to eat too fast and were gently stopped by medics. Others wept at the smell alone: coffee, sugar, something warm. For soldiers who had lived for years on watery rice, even a spoonful of mashed potatoes was almost unbearable in its richness. These moments became small resurrections. Witnesses described the silence of men eating, the scrape of spoons, the murmurs of real food. Medics recorded pulse rates climbing, color returning to faces. A few were too weak to chew and were fed through sips of milk and soup. Their eyes lit up like candles, one corpsman wrote. You could see them realizing they were alive. Behind that recovery was the largest coordinated medical relief effort of the Pacific Campaign. In the days following liberation, field hospitals and Army Service Corps kitchens operated without pause. Trucks arrived with rations, vitamins, quinine, and plasma. Naval air transports ferried crates labeled food. Special POW, a new category invented just for this mission. The human angle extended beyond the Americans themselves. Filipino civilians brought bananas, rice, and eggs to the camps. Many had risked death for years smuggling food to prisoners under occupation. Now they walked through the gates openly, some in tears, offering baskets of fruit to the emaciated men. The Japanese guards who survived the raid stood nearby under guard, silent, watching. Some had participated in beatings only days earlier. Others were too stunned to speak. For them, the sight of the prisoners being fed, not punished, not ignored, but fed, seemed incomprehensible. They had been taught that the American way of war was mechanical, soulless, driven only by machines. But here they saw something else, a nation that had built an empire of compassion through logistics. American medics noted the irony without comment. The very rations that the Japanese army had mocked as proof of weakness, tins of sweet milk, chocolate, canned meat were now instruments of life. Medical teams kept detailed records. They weighed each man daily, charted temperature and heart rate, and controlled every calorie. Within weeks, many had gained 10, even 20 pounds. The turnaround astonished observers. General Walter Kruger called it a victory of science as much as arms, yet the healing was not only physical. Eating together again, at a table, with utensils, with laughter, restored a sense of dignity long erased by captivity. For many POWs, the first shared meal was their re-entry into humanity. Some of those moments were captured in film and photographs, gaunt faces half smiling over mess tins. Medics ladling soup into tin cups, a sergeant holding up a can of Spam as if it were a trophy. These images circulated in American newspapers, reinforcing the moral of the war. Industry and mercy intertwined, but beneath the relief ran a deeper current: guilt. Many of the liberated men could not eat without thinking of those left behind, those who had died with empty stomachs days before rescue. Some refused second helpings, setting portions aside as if for absent comrades. In letters home, survivors often mentioned food not as pleasure, but as symbol, a promise kept. One wrote, "They said we were dead men, but America sent us breakfast." That line, printed later in stars and stripes, captured the human essence of the event. The war was far from over, yet in that camp, amid the smell of cooking fat and boiled coffee, a truth had emerged. Power was not only measured in weapons, but in the ability to feed, heal, and restore. The medical angle proved that victory in modern war required mastery not just of killing, but of survival. The U.S. military had learned how to sustain life as efficiently as it waged destruction. From this point, the story widens beyond the wounded body toward the systems that made such mercy possible: the engineers, sailors, and quartermasters who built the arteries of supply across the Pacific. They were the unseen architects of that first hot meal, and their precision would define the next chapter of this story, the tactical and logistical angles that made such rescues possible. The rescue at Cabanatuan was not just a triumph of courage, it was a triumph of logistics. Every minute, every ration, every bullet was calculated. Behind the silent rangers who crawled through the fields that night stood a network of ships, trains, and factories that stretched from Kansas to Manila Bay. The operation was rehearsed in detail. American and Filipino scouts had mapped the terrain for weeks, counting guard rotations, timing the floodlights, and plotting the exact moment of approach. But what made it possible to sustain such precision was the constant flow of supplies behind them. Gasoline, ammunition, and yes, food. Even in the final weeks of January 1945, as the front lines shifted daily, quartermasters ensured that each assault force carried enough rations not only for themselves, but for the men they hoped to rescue. In war, feeding an army is as decisive as fighting one. The U.S. understood that early. The Army Service Forces, under General Brahan Somerville, had created a logistical doctrine so robust that combat divisions could operate thousands of miles from their depots without collapse. Mobile kitchens followed infantry columns. Refrigerated ships crossed oceans. Field bakeries turned out tens of thousands of loaves a day. The Japanese, by contrast, relied on a doctrine of endurance. Supply chains were secondary to willpower. On remote islands, they lived off the land, fishing and foraging. It worked out briefly out in China and early campaigns, but in the Pacific, isolation was deadly. Once the U.S. Navy gained control of the seas, Japanese garrisons withered. When hunger arrived, discipline decayed, and disease followed. The contrast was not just material, it was moral. To the Japanese mind, depending on canned food was weakness. To the Americans, it was ingenuity. One side sought glory through suffering, the other through problem-solving. That divergence shaped the psychology of the entire war. When Japanese soldiers later witnessed the aftermath of Cabanatuan and other rescues, their astonishment was genuine. Some reports from Japanese officers captured after the war mentioned disbelief that Americans could feed so many men so quickly in a war zone. One officer reportedly remarked, "Even their prisoners eat like officers," to men who had grown up equating scarcity with virtue. The sight of abundance, controlled, efficient, purposefully carried an almost moral weight. In military terms, logistics had become strategy. The U.S. Army's Red Bull Express in Europe and its Pacific convoys served as arteries of civilization. Fuel, food, medicine, and ammunition flowed together as instruments of liberation. The concept of total supply, feeding both the fighters and the rescued, became a moral code within itself. At Los Barras, another daring raid in February 1945, paratroopers of the 11th Airborne Division executed one of the most complex combined operations of the war. They dropped from C-47s at dawn, coordinated with amphibious landing craft and Filipino guerrillas, and freed more than 2,000 civilians and POWs. Within hours, the same rations that sustained combat troops were distributed to prisoners. U.S. field kitchens set up under palm trees, serving soup, canned fruit, and milk from powdered mix. It was, as one survivor later said, the taste of America itself. The moral dimension of these operations was unmistakable. Feeding the liberated became a visible declaration of values, proof that, even amid total war, the Allies believed in restoration, not annihilation. The act of nourishment carried symbolic weight equal to any victory parade. For the Japanese who witnessed it, the experience was disorienting. Propaganda had long portrayed Americans as decadent consumers, enslaved to material comfort. Yet the men they saw now were disciplined, organized, and compassionate, turning industrial abundance into mercy. It was a lesson in contrasts too profound to ignore. Meanwhile, U.S. logisticians documented everything. Every crate unloaded, every calorie served, every casualty saved through proper feeding. They knew that future wars would hinge on these lessons. Manuals published in late 1945 devoted chapters to feeding liberated prisoners and emergency nutritional recovery. The science of war had absorbed the science of care, but behind the numbers were moral questions that lingered. Could the same machinery that dropped bombs also feed the starving? Could industrial power serve both destruction and salvation without contradiction? American commanders rarely spoke of it publicly, yet many diaries revealed the quiet pride of those who had delivered not just victory, but compassion at scale. In one after-action report, a logistics officer wrote simply, "We fed them before we counted them." That single sentence summarized the ethos that defined American power in 1945, efficiency fused with empathy. To the prisoners, it meant survival. To the Japanese witnesses, it was a revelation of what modern war could be when driven by conscience as much as calculation. The moral resonance of those meals would ripple far beyond the camp gates. In post-war Japan, occupation forces brought similar rations to feed civilians in famine-stricken regions. The same tins once mocked as symbols of indulgence became lifelines in Reconstruction. Thus, the tactical, logistical, and moral dimensions converged into one truth. America's ability to feed was inseparable from its ability to fight. The Cabanatuan raid was not only a rescue, it was a demonstration that industrial democracy could outsupply, outlast, and outcare any empire built on endurance alone. As the rescued men regained strength and the guards faced capture, the balance of power in the Pacific shifted irreversibly. But the most decisive moment, the emotional heart of this story, was still to come when liberation turned into revelation and the world saw what it truly meant to eat like kings. January 30th, 1945, Cabanatuan Prison Camp, Luzon. The night air was dry and cool, rare mercy after months of tropical heat. From the north, a faint hum trembled through the fields, the sound of engines idling in the dark. At 1900 hours, the men of the 6th Ranger Battalion, the Alamo Scouts, and hundreds of Filipino guerrillas were in position for weeks. They had studied the terrain, a flat stretch of farmland surrounded by irrigation ditches and a dirt road lined with sugarcane. The Japanese garrison inside numbered around 200 men, too many for a frontal assault. Too few to resist a perfectly timed strike, the Rangers had come for 511 Allied prisoners, many survivors of the Bataan Death March. Held since 1942, their mission was simple and impossible: get them all out alive before the Japanese could react or send reinforcements from the nearby city of Cabanatuan at 1945 hours. A single American P-61 Black Widow fighter roared overhead, executing a mock attack to distract the guards. They looked up, shouting orders as shadows moved through the grass below. Then, silence broke into fire. From the northern perimeter, Captain Robert Prince led his platoon forward, firing in short bursts, suppressing the watchtowers. Guerrillas blocked the roads, cutting off escape routes. Inside the camp, confusion spread like lightning. Some guards ran for weapons. Others froze in disbelief. Prisoners stumbled from their huts, dazed, unable to understand what was happening. The first Americans they saw were not doctors or officers, but Rangers shouting, "Get down! You're going home!" The liberation unfolded in minutes. Rangers smashed through the gates, covering prisoners as they crawled through the mud toward waiting carabao carts and trucks. Filipino civilians helped carry the weakest of men so light they could be lifted with one arm. Every second mattered. From the west, Japanese patrols were already approaching, drawn by the noise. At 2,100 hours, tracer rounds stitched the horizon. The Rangers held their ground, buying time. When the last prisoner cleared the gate, the order went out: move. The convoy jolted to life. Prisoners huddled in the backs of carts, blankets wrapped around shoulders that had forgotten warmth. They traveled through narrow farm tracks under starlight, every bump a shock to fragile bodies. Some wept quietly. Others sat in stunned silence. Behind them, the camp burned. The smell of bamboo smoke and kerosene mixed with the sweet odor of liberation, something indescribable yet unmistakably real. By dawn, the column reached American lines at Talavera. Exhausted medics met them with stretchers, water, and soft voices. The first thing many of the prisoners saw was not soldiers with rifles, but men holding trays of food, K-rations, C-rations, and thermoses of coffee. An army photographer recorded the scene: skeletal figures wrapped in blankets, eyes hollow yet brightening as steam rose from tin cups. They had expected interrogation, treatment, maybe even indifference. Instead, they were offered breakfast. A medic later wrote they had no strength to smile, but their eyes said everything. It wasn't just rescue, it was resurrection. Back in the destroyed camp, captured Japanese soldiers stood in shock. They had fought to hold the prisoners until reinforcements arrived, believing it impossible for Americans to risk so much for men already defeated. To them, the raid defied logic. The enemy, they thought, was supposed to abandon the weak. Instead, the Americans had crossed enemy lines to feed them. The success of the Cabanatuan raid reverberated across the Pacific. Within days, the story reached the press corps in Manila and later. Headlines in the United States: Rangers free 500 prisoners from Japanese hell camp. But what those headlines couldn't convey was the quiet, intimate climax that followed, the moment when survival turned into nourishment. It wasn't in the gunfire or the burning huts, but in the mess tents that rose the next morning, where doctors and cooks stood side by side preparing meals for the living dead. As dawn turned to day, the prisoners' hunger, once an unending enemy, met the full force of American abundance. What began as a military operation was about to become a human revelation the moment Japanese observers, prisoners, and even rescuers would understand that power in war could be measured not only in destruction, but in compassion served warm. Morning light broke across the field hospital like a slow, golden tide. The men who had arrived only hours before barely alive, barely human, were now wrapped in clean sheets, their names being recorded, their pulse checked. Their eyes still darting as if expecting another order barked in Japanese. In one corner, army cooks set up large steel pots. The sound of ladles scraping, water boiling, and cans opening filled the air. The first smell that drifted across the tents wasn't medicine or antiseptic, it was food. A pot of beef stew bubbled over an open flame. It sent thick people with onions, potatoes, and a luxury most of these men hadn't seen in 3 years, meat. On a nearby table, tins of fruit cocktail gleamed like treasure. Bread, soft and white, was sliced in neat rows beside steaming mugs of black coffee. For the liberated POWs, this was no ordinary breakfast. It was their first real meal since 1942. Some stared at the food in disbelief. They'd eaten little more than rice husks, insects, and scraps from garbage piles for months. Their bodies trembled not just from hunger, but from disbelief. One survivor, Lt. James Fisher, later recalled, "When they handed me that first cup of coffee, I cried. I didn't sip it, I just held it. The smell alone felt like home." Nearby, medics warned the cooks to go slow. The men's stomachs were too fragile for heavy food. They served small portions, 5 bites at a time, every few hours. Even so, the emotional shock was overwhelming. The Japanese guards who had been captured and brought under escort watched the scene unfold from a distance. One sergeant, SGT Kiyoshi Yamane, whispered to his interpreter, "They feed them like honored guests. We would never." His voice trailed off. He didn't finish the thought. The difference was not just food, it was philosophy. To the Japanese military mind, captivity was shame. Prisoners were failures. Feeding them well would have seemed absurd. To Americans, feeding them was duty, proof of civilization, of the moral line that separated survival from savagery. As the morning stretched on, news crews arrived, documenting every detail. The camera lens captured emaciated bodies holding forks with trembling hands. It showed laughter breaking through silence, and soldiers trading cigarettes for stories. One sequence filmed by Army cameraman Gaetano Fales showed a group of rangers sitting beside the prisoners, sharing the same stew. They didn't eat separately or stand over them. They ate together. To the Japanese observers later studying the footage, this behavior was incomprehensible. One officer at the Tokyo War College reportedly remarked, "They do not fight only with guns. They fight with comfort." Across the Pacific, when the newsreel reached American theaters, audiences stood and applauded, not for victory but for mercy. Mothers who had lost sons in Bataan wept as they saw strangers feeding the men their sons once marched beside. The images were more powerful than any speech. America was not just winning through might, it was winning through humanity. That same night, the rescued men slept under white canvas for the first time in years. Some awoke in panic, forgetting they were free, until they heard voices speaking English again. In the distance, a generator hummed. Someone was heating more coffee. A medic wrote in his journal, "We gave them food, but what they really consumed was dignity." It was the taste of being human again. In Japan, propaganda officers struggled to explain the loss. The official line called the raid a cowardly attack, a dishonorable ambush. But among frontline soldiers, the story spread differently. Men whispered about the Americans who risked their lives not for conquest, but to feed their own. One captured Japanese corporal admitted during interrogation, "We thought the Americans were soft. Now we think they are dangerous because they care." That simple statement captured the emotional climax of the war in microcosm. The battle for survival was also a battle for meaning. In that camp, over bowls of stew and tin cups of coffee, the lines between victory and compassion blurred. The prisoners began to laugh again, small, uncertain, fragile sounds that broke through the ghosts of 3 years in darkness. As one ranger later said, "They didn't need medals. They needed seconds, and so they got them." Plates refilled, coffee poured again, and through the rising smoke of breakfast fires came a quiet understanding shared by rescuers and rescued alike. America's strength was not only in its weapons, it was in its will to feed, to heal, to restore. The liberation of Cabanatuan was no longer just a tactical success. It had become a moral declaration, one that stunned even its enemies, and in the days that followed, its echoes would ripple across the Pacific, reshaping both military morale and the psychology of an empire. The news of the Cabanatuan raid spread across the Pacific like a coded signal of defiance. For the first time in 3 years, Allied command had not only struck deep behind enemy lines but had brought their men home alive. General Douglas MacArthur, receiving the first reports in his Manila headquarters, was said to have stood silently for several seconds before replying. Tell Colonel Mucci and his men they have redeemed Bataan. To the Americans, it was more than a military victory. It was emotional closure, a message sent directly to every surviving veteran of 1942. You have not been forgotten. Strategically, the raid demonstrated something far greater than daring. It proved that the U.S. could coordinate intelligence, guerrilla warfare, air support, and logistics in perfect harmony. The use of Filipino resistance fighters as guides and local scouts was a model of hybrid warfare that would influence operations for decades to come, but the psychological shock was even greater. In Tokyo, military analysts were furious. The Imperial Army had insisted that Allied prisoners were secure, weak, broken, contained. The raid shattered that illusion. It showed that Japanese-controlled territory was vulnerable. That American command had the reach and confidence to strike anywhere. Anytime. Japanese propaganda tried to downplay the event, calling it an exaggerated rescue of sick prisoners, yet reports filtered back through occupied Luzon, stories told by farmers and guerrillas who had witnessed the burning camp, the American vehicles racing under moonlight, the explosions echoing through rice paddies. These whispers became legends. For the Japanese soldier in the field, it was something different, unsettling. If Americans could risk hundreds of men to save a few hundred more, what did that say about their resolve? Many had been told Americans were decadent, soft, incapable of endurance. But this was the opposite of weakness. One Japanese major captured weeks later admitted to interrogators they treat their prisoners as treasures. For us, prisoners are shameful. Perhaps that is why they fight so hard. They know someone will come for them. Meanwhile, in the United States, newspapers ran front-page photographs of the rescued men, gaunt, smiling, their hands gripping mugs of coffee like relics. Beneath the images ran headlines such as, "They held on, and we came back for them, public morale soared." War bond sales spiked. Veterans organizations held rallies, and small towns across America adopted returning POWs as local heroes. The military quietly studied the mission's broader implications. The Cabanatuan raid was not just a tactical success, it was a moral and psychological weapon. It demonstrated that America's strength wasn't confined to its machinery or its armies. It lay in its loyalty. At a time when the war still had brutal months to go, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the looming invasion of Japan. The message was clear: the U.S. would spare nothing for its own. Back in Luzon, the rescued men were moved to hospitals near Manila. There, they were reunited with comrades, officers, and, in some cases, journalists who had covered their surrender. In 1942, the contrast was staggering. Men who once weighed 200 pounds now barely touched 100. Yet, when asked what they remembered most from the rescue, most didn't mention the raid itself, nor the gunfire. They mentioned breakfast. The stew, the bread, the coffee. For them, that meal symbolized something deeper than survival. It was proof of humanity's return after years of degradation. As one soldier said from his hospital bed, "We thought we were ghosts. Then they fed us, and we realized we were alive." That was the true victory, not the destruction of an enemy, but the restoration of the human spirit. And as MacArthur prepared his next move north toward Manila, the lesson of Cabanatuan would linger in every briefing and every soldier's mind. America not only conquered territory, it conquered despair. In the weeks following the raid, the effects of Cabanatuan reached far beyond the jungles of Luzon. It was more than a rescue, it was a symbol. One that carried across oceans and into the hearts of men still fighting or imprisoned. When the first film reels of the operation reached Allied theaters, audiences saw what words could not describe: skeletal soldiers smiling, rangers clasping their hands, Filipino villagers cheering as the trucks rumbled past. The footage played before war bond rallies and in military briefings. It was raw, unfiltered proof that honor and endurance could outlast brutality. British and Australian officers, many still commanding forces across Burma and New Guinea, studied the operation with awe. One British war correspondent wrote from Calcutta, "It was the first true miracle of the Pacific War, not of faith, but of will, for the Axis powers." However, the event caused quiet unease. In Germany, intercepted Japanese messages revealed Tokyo's alarm. The Imperial High Command had long believed the American emphasis on individual lives was a weakness. Yet Cabanatuan inverted that belief, showing that it was precisely this reverence for the individual soldier that made the U.S. military so relentless behind closed doors. A Japanese officer summed it up grimly, "They fight with a heart we do not understand." That is their weapon. Meanwhile, the men of the 6th Ranger Battalion returned to camp in silence. There were no grand parades or speeches, just quiet satisfaction. Their commander, Lt. Col. Henry Mucci, told his men simply, "You've done something the world will never forget." And he was right. The raid reshaped how armies viewed prisoner recovery operations. Future doctrines would draw directly from the Cabanatuan template: detailed reconnaissance, local resistance cooperation, surprise, and precise withdrawal. It became the blueprint for modern special operations, the DNA of what would later become U.S. Army Rangers, Delta Force, and JSOC rescue missions, but perhaps the deepest legacy was emotional. In post-war Japan, when footage of the rescued POWs eating U.S. rations circulated during American occupation newsreels, civilians were stunned. Many had never seen such abundance. Bread, coffee, canned fruit, simple items were symbols of a life that Japan's war economy could no longer provide. For a generation raised on scarcity and sacrifice, those images carried both envy and revelation. One Japanese journalist, watching the reels in 1946, wrote, "We believed we were dying for honor. They fought to live for comfort. In the end, they were stronger." The cultural shock was profound. It revealed a civilization powered not by ancient hierarchy, but by modern logistics, and empire of factories, farms, and human empathy. In America, the rescued men quietly rebuilt their lives. Many never spoke much of what they endured, but the memory of that first post-liberation meal, hot stew and coffee, stayed with them until death. For them, the food wasn't luxury. It was identity. Years later, when veterans gathered at reunions, one topic always returned. It wasn't tactics or heroics, it was that morning, sitting in the sun with steam rising from tin cups. That was when they felt human again. In history books, the Cabanatuan raid is remembered as one of the most successful special operations of World War II, but for those who lived it, it wasn't just about escape, it was about return to dignity, to belonging, to the taste of freedom itself. Even today, military academies teach the raid not only as strategy, but as morality in motion, a moment when war briefly remembered its soul. The Japanese soldiers who once mocked American rations had witnessed the truth. Those humble meals, the cans, the coffee, the bread, were not signs of indulgence. They were evidence of something far more powerful, a civilization that could feed compassion even in war. Was a civilization destined to prevail, and as the sun set on the Philippine plains that evening in 1945, a single image remained: the rescued prisoners, seated quietly, eating like kings under the American flag. War is often measured in firepower, numbers, and victories. But at Cabanatuan, history found another measure: compassion. What began as a daring mission became something deeper, a moral statement. The raid had proven that in a world consumed by destruction, there remained one nation willing to fight for the sanctity of life itself. The Japanese soldiers who mocked U.S. rations had once believed that power lay in endurance, in hunger, sacrifice, and blind loyalty. Yet in the end, they stood astonished before a different truth, that strength could wear the face of mercy. Those American rations, the cans of meat, the bread, the coffee, became more than sustenance. They became symbols of what the war had always been about. Beneath the battles and bombs, to visions of humanity colliding. One saw survival through obedience. The other, through care. The raid at Cabanatuan was not grand in scale compared to Iwo Jima or Normandy, but in its simplicity. Men crossing enemy lines not to kill, but to feed, it carried a spiritual weight that transcended numbers. It told every soldier, every prisoner, every mother waiting back home, we do not abandon our own dot. In that quiet truth, America's greatest strength revealed itself. It was not its tanks or bombers or endless factories, but the will to preserve dignity, to defend the human soul even amid the machinery of war. When those emaciated prisoners lifted their first spoons of stew, they were not just eating. They were reclaiming their humanity. And when their rescuers stood beside them, sharing the same rations, it became clear that victory was not just about defeating an empire. It was about restoring a world worth living in. History would record the Cabanatuan raid as one of World War II's most extraordinary rescues. Yet its legacy endures far beyond the battlefield, a quiet reminder that compassion, even when surrounded by chaos, can be the most formidable weapon of all. And so, in the fading light of January 1945, among fields of sugar cane and the smoke of liberation, the world saw something rare: soldiers who fought their way through hell to bring breakfast to the living.